So what comes to mind?
Yeah, we were talking with Vanessa, this prompt of say whatever comes to mind. And I think I was wondering if perhaps the trap could be that one always may go back to the same place rather than say something new. So whatever, I'm happy to see you, Vanessa. We haven't seen you in person since a while before the beginning of the pandemic, and we were talking about the transformations of our lives because of that. So
Absolutely. You came to Stockholm, though, in 2019 for the SIP conference.
Yes, yes. So that was one, I think one of the last, I think was even earlier than that. Wasn't it 2018? I think was.
No, it's 2019.
Okay. So was one of the last, it was in May of 2019. You're right. Okay, I have a sort of strange chronology in my mind. It's like BC, before COVID, and after. Not. I hope we are in the after of COVID. It's not very clear yet, and how our lives have been transformed. I think we were a little skeptical at the beginning of how much psychoanalysis will have a place in a pandemic, in the midst of a global catastrophe, and to my surprise, I discovered that psychoanalysis had something unique to offer. I was very skeptical at the beginning, thinking that perhaps as psychoanalysts, we would have been more useful as simple citizens, that there were other forms of intervention we could offer. But I was surprised to see that during the pandemic, I have many people contacting me and wanting to start analysis, and many of them are doing amazing progress. And many started remotely, and some of them are continuing. Others, I was able to get them back into the office. But for those who, for different reasons, could not continue in person, we saw really a sense of urgency. I think there was something that changed with the pandemic, I think in the perhaps perception of temporality, which maybe is something we could talk about, and psychoanalysis sometimes is something very special time in analysis if we take as point of departure what Freud says, that the unconscious doesn't know of time in the sense of chronological time. And the sense of urgency that the pandemic made people rethink their priorities, and it's interesting to know that psychoanalysis became one of those things that were perhaps left aside. People say, something I would like to do, but no, now I'll do later. And the sense of maybe the situation of danger we were living in created a sense of urgency that people no longer wanted to postpone something they really wanted to do, that may perhaps room more for desire, even though it may sound counterintuitive in the middle of the pandemic. Is there room for desire? In many people found the space in psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis had something unique to offer. Yes, I see you nodding. I don't know if you have.
No, I was pleasantly surprised to find that as well. People came in and are doing great work, and yeah, and I think maybe even now more than ever, people need to kind of find a place for desire, because yeah, it's important. People's priorities are changing, and people are realizing, like, why am I doing this kind of day-to-day job, or like, what do I want my day-to-day life to look like? There's more of a sense of urgency. So many people have lost so many people, and yeah, it really changes your perspective on what's important,
Yeah, because indeed, more often people come to see us when they find themselves in a situation of crisis, and it's not unusual, the sense of urgency. We could sum it up like, I cannot put up with any second more of this. That's in a way a common feature. But I think the pandemic exacerbated perhaps that sense that there was no time to postpone anymore. And I think perhaps people are making decisions, maybe given priority to issues that were perhaps neglected, like relationships and life choices about where to live, how many hours to devote to work rather than to interaction with loved ones. So I think it made people put things into perspective. And we saw also transformation in our practice, that we were like in a matter of days transform our modality of practice into mostly remote practices, and has created an effect of globalization without moving from my chair. There were days where I was giving a talk in Turkey in the morning, in Mexico in the afternoon, and the day after I was going to Brazil in the morning. So it was without ever leaving the chair you see me sitting in right now. So that's, in a way, I like traveling, so I would have preferred to personally have been in those places, visited maybe places I haven't yet gone to, like Turkey, but allow a certain accessibility. And if we think that psychoanalysis is an international movement, I think that's how Freud from the beginning thought of psychoanalysis. The possibility of working remotely makes that very clear, that it can be, there are events where people from many different geographical locations can join, participate. Even my reading group that used to meet here in Philadelphia, we had a psychoanalyst from Iran that would wake up at 3 a.m. to join the meeting because of the time difference. I was very full of admiration for that level of devotion and transference to psychoanalysis, but allow for access that normally was, the seminar was limited to those who were in the geographical surroundings. And that, I think, was a nice, good development that allowed for a sort of democratization of psychoanalytic transmission. That there were many, many events happening and made accessible.
Absolutely. And I love, like you said, I loved especially when people would be like on the same panel and they would be in different parts of the world. And there's like very little to no lag. You know, it's amazing that we can have these conversations from different sides of the globe and like in real time. I love to see that.
Yeah, but maybe it sounds like if we real time, almost like real with capital R in the Lacanian sense, is no longer chronological, but for some maybe 3 a.m. It happened to me, for instance, I gave a talk in New Zealand, and it was very bewildering for me that for me it was a Friday evening and for them was Saturday morning. So I felt I was talking into the future, as it were. Or I was stuck in the past also, however you want to look at it. So in the way, it makes us aware that time is also a sort of fiction that we live by, or at least when we try to create a chronological frame of time. And maybe we are more operating in the time of dreams, the immediacy of the now, whenever that happens. It could be Friday night for me or Saturday morning for those in New Zealand. So that was also interesting to bring together all these accessibility. And also when it made me think that the democratization of psychoanalysis also, I don't know if it was, you may have observed the same, Vanessa, that it felt like there was a sort of awareness of the political aspects of psychoanalytic discourse, that the tone of the discussion, the content, they were in a way considering the events in the COVID pandemic, the maybe awareness around social and racial injustice in the US, the Black Lives Matter movement, that many of the discussions in psychoanalytic groups were posing questions about political issues that up to then were somehow, we may say, if not repressed, perhaps only forgotten. And it was not only the democratization in terms of accessibility, but also there was a transformation in the content that I found also very promising, that no longer psychoanalysts could think of themselves as having a practice outside of history, that there is this illusion, at least in the North American context, that psychoanalysis is outside history. And it was clear that we were overdetermined by historical circumstances, and they were being addressed directly, which was also quite interesting, that development.
Yeah, it's really important. And that's something, I mean, you've written so many great books, but the book that you wrote on the Puerto Rican syndrome, I tell everybody that's like a must read book, because it's so beautiful the way that you talk about, how psychology and psychoanalysis developed over time, and the way that these kinds of diagnoses were used, and how things were intertwined with the military and the kind of, government control mechanisms. And it's just so important, and you lay it out so clearly and beautiful. And your work has really dealt with these issues, throughout, as far as I know, your whole career, and it's really important. And then this event that Michael Ben sent me today, that you're going to be talking about, what was it called? The Monsters Within, the Monsters Without. And I love how you're addressing like the field itself, and how psychoanalysis kind of really needs to make a change and get out of these kind of patriarchal structures, because I feel the same way. And I think, like you said, like sexuality and gender, it really is at the core. It's something that people want to control so much from the outside, what people can and cannot do with their bodies and their sexuality and their gender, which just makes it's such a potent and important place to start. And it's already happening.
But it was happening without our awareness. Happily, I think, analysts, we are very lucky to have our analysts guiding us. I think that's what happened. That's how Freud ended up inventing psychoanalysis. He was, I think, the brilliancy of Freud was to allow himself to be guided by the clinical practice, and he was very willing to make technical modifications. If you think of how psychoanalysis was invented as a practice, all the early modifications in the practice were guided by those analysts, I think pioneering analysts that were at the time considered simply recalcitrant patients, because they have opaque symptoms for which the medicine of the time had no answers. And Freud was opening to listen, to take them at their word, but also to follow their suggestions. Like in the beginning, a little caught up with the hypnotic model, he would put a hand on the forehead and say, "Tell me what comes to mind." And then one of these hysterics of yesteryear, as Lacan calls them, would say, no, I feel freer to talk if you don't touch me. Freud then realized it's better not to have physical contact. Speech will flow better, and so on. So all the modifications and how the technique was, in a way, improved and modified was being guided by the practice. And I think that continues. Happily, we are being awoken from our different sleeps and delusions by analysts themselves, who guide us, I think, on the truth of, by exposing us to the truth of what they're saying. And this is what happened. You were mentioning my first book, The Puerto Rican Syndrome, is simply the result of my clinical practice working in a social location that is often considered outside the reach of the unconscious, working in the barrio, and discovering this strange label, the Puerto Rican syndrome, that caught my attention, because I have never heard up to then of any nationality attached to a psychiatric diagnosis. Nobody talks about French melancholy, American anxiety, Argentinian narcissism, and so on. But there was a Puerto Rican syndrome, curiously enough, for a nation that is not independent, that is still living in a semi-colonial state. And when I look closely at the literature on the Puerto Rican syndrome, I was surprised by seeing that it happened to be an exact description of the most classical form of hysteria, one that for a psychoanalyst is quite in that led to the invention of psychoanalysis, hysteria with theatrical symptoms looking like epilepsy, but with no real anatomical correlation. Exposed to me was, on the one hand, the racism of psychiatric practices. One single diagnosis could condense that otherness is pathologized, but also from the perspective of those happening to or experiencing this ataque de nervios or Puerto Rican syndrome, that at times individual symptoms could function like allegories of social conditions, because the label is, of course, clinical and unique for each person happening that, undergoing that situation that produces this type of symptoms, but also condenses political and cultural issues. So it's individual and collective at the same time, political and clinical, and in that sense condenses what our practice is, that is never isolated, is always traverse. It's a little what Freud says already, that when we look closely at individual psychology, is also at the same time social psychology. And at times we need to not only analyze the analysm themselves, but also our practice as psychoanalysts or psychoanalytic institutions. And you were also mentioning this presentation I'm going to do soon, that takes as inspiration this lecture given by Paul Preciado in 2019. I think was one of the last in-person events in the psychoanalytic community, was a gathering in Paris of 3,500 Lacanian psychoanalysts, and they were convoked under it was a conference on women in psychoanalysis. That was the title of the event, and the keynote speaker was Paul Preciado. Ooh, and that lecture was amazing because it created what some people describe as an earthquake. It's just the opening words of Paul Preciado were, "Ladies and gentlemen, and those who are neither ladies nor gentlemen, good afternoon." And that already divided the audience. There were those who were booing and those who were applauding, a little timidly perhaps. And in a way, it already expresses a symptom of a sad history in psychoanalysis of imposing heterosexist prejudice onto the practice and who should practice psychoanalysis and what would be a model of ideal health and supposed normalcy, that it is antithetical, it goes against psychoanalytic concepts. I also take inspiration of the conclusion of this lecture that unhappily Paul Preciado could not give in its entirety, was interrupted before he could complete the talk. He then published it as a book, so it's available in several languages. Already the lecture was immediately recorded on people's cell phones, and it became as viral as a porn tape or a porn video. Everybody was watching it, and it was immediately transcribed into Portuguese, and it was translated Portuguese, English, was translated into Spanish, and there were all these unauthorized versions circulating of the lecture. Then it was published, now it's published as a book. Can the Monster Speak, I think is the translation into English. There are different titles in different languages, which we could talk about it. That's also interesting. And Paul Preciado concludes the talk that is a criticism of certain tendency in psychoanalysis that not all psychoanalysts support, but many do, and happily, of imposing a model of normalcy. And in that way, that model, imposition of a model of normalcy, is what could be a connected thread in my work. I was working in the barrio with people marginalized by what is constructed as their race, or marginalized by their social position, by their class, and considered excluded out of the reach of psychoanalysis. That is something I'm quite opposed to. I believe that anyone can benefit. Those who can benefit from psychoanalysis can benefit, that income is not a factor that prevents someone from benefiting from psychoanalysis. And also working with analysts who had been marginalized because of their sexuality or because of their gender. So in a way, that would be the common thread. Those who had been marginalized by oppressive notions of sexual normalcy, gender normalcy, racial alienation or racial belonging, class, and so on. So to go back to Paul Preciado, what I work in that forthcoming lecture, is this in a way challenge that Paul Preciado makes to analysis, or maybe it's a wish as well. We were talking about desire. I think desire is the compass of psychoanalysis, is its ethical guide and compass as well. That if there is a future for psychoanalysis, it should be de-heterosexual, de-patriarchal, and decolonized. And I think it's an important guide to keep in mind. And I think we need to really consider how could we, and I think this is a point of departure, is to become aware of from what position are we speaking as analysts, how we may be traversed by colonial discourse, how we could be repeating oppressive notions that could, in a way, make us deaf to things we should be listening in the practice.
Yeah, because that's one of the things you outline, like it's the big difference between psychology and psychoanalysis. Psychology has been a tool that's used by the state to keep people very normalized, medicated, working, to keep the capitalist machine going, and psychoanalysis is supposed to not do that in my mind. We're supposed to really allow space for people to speak and to find their own way that's totally, anti-normative. There shouldn't be any norms put on there. If anything, I feel like people have internalized so many norms and they have to piece them, take them apart and figure out whose voice is this, who told me this, where did this come from, so they can figure out where their own voice is, instead of identifying with all these other kind of voices and labels that have been put upon them. And so when I see psychoanalysis falling into these same kind of tropes, it's just so frustrating to me.
Yeah, because if we consider that psychoanalysis is not an orthopedics, that there is not a pre-established model we need to comply with, that maybe one way of differentiating psychology from psychoanalysis is that in psychology we transform the symptoms. Psychological strategies could be effective and they could help with the symptoms, but the subject is not transformed. Whereas in psychoanalysis, the transformation is in the subject that may perhaps keep the same symptoms, but relate to them differently. That's why somebody like Zizek may say, enjoy your symptoms. No longer a symptom you suffer. It could be a symptom that makes life livable, that you could enjoy. And also, I think what is important is that there is no predetermined idea. We don't know from the start how that transformation would take place. And in that sense, that's where I think the emancipatory power of psychoanalysis resides, that we are not imposing a pre-thought model of this is what this person needs to become. It's something that that subject will reclaim some freedom to take distance, what you were saying, these voices we have, these labels. At the end of an analysis, there is a distance from what you use Lacanian jargon would be the big other. We are no longer so determined by these mandates that could come from family expectations, the name that was chosen for us to carry that may not be the same name at some point in life, or may not have the same meanings or overdetermination, that there is a little bit of freedom, and is still maybe a little bit, but still freedom that could allow us to then exercise perhaps a different kind of a choice, not imposed from the exterior, but rather a decision, a subjective decision. That Absolutely. The authority is the analysand, not the analyst, or not the outside big other. That there is, I think, a possibility of taking distance.
Yeah, exactly.
And when we think of oppressed minorities, however they may be oppressed, I think that's of great importance to provide a space where that can happen.
Absolutely. And I think that another great thing to say about the Puerto Rican syndrome. I just love that book. But having worked in hospitals, and for people that are working in hospitals or working with people that are not the high SES, clientele that the psychoanalysts talk about, being able to be in psychoanalysis, it's really refreshing to see this perspective. And then, of course, there's the follow-up book of Psychoanalysis in El Barrio that came out more recently. It's a edited collection. But it's so important because when I was working in the hospital and HIV clinic in Brooklyn, the way that they ask us to treat patients, it's just like, I'm not going to talk to people like that or treat adults that way. It's like I'm going to listen to them. And, my supervisor was very much like, frustrated with me that I wasn't like doing these CBT or doing what they were asking me to do with people. But it's like, I'm just not going to treat adults that way. And they had very much this attitude of like, oh, but they can't benefit for anything else, and it's just like, who says that? Like, why do people think that? And of course people can benefit. I mean, who can't benefit from being listened to and having a space to speak,
Yeah, but that's not often taken into account. That I think that there is a tendency to infantilize, marginalized populations, and there is this sort of paternalistic position that they need guidance, and it creates really a very oppressive model where the analyst is positioned as the master who would, or the pedagogue, or the oppressor, in a way that is going to reproduce the same structures that would, in a way, perpetuate that position of oppression and marginalization. And I think it's important to keep in mind that psychoanalysis has a proposition where we take a person at their word. We see them as grammatical subjects, and to treat somebody as a subject, not as an object. Often they are objectified, even maybe in the name of good intentions, but we know that times good intentions could hide the most sadistic and aggressive forms of violence. That to take somebody at their word and give them a space where they can exercise their subjective responsibility. Often we see even in practitioners who supposedly have good intentions, and it's not simply a humanistic position of respect for the other. I think it's an ethical stance of a basic respect and assumption that the other is another in all its otherness, but respecting that I think psychoanalysis factors in otherness in a productive way that creates a space of subjective responsibilities. I think the opposite of an infantilizing position, and that how important it is for somebody who is experiencing life, always been ascribed this marginalized position, to be in a place where someone is not only listening to them, but also, I think this is the amazing thing of psychoanalysis. It's a little like when a cell phone has bad connection, that at times you hear an echo of yourself, or at times, I don't think it happens so much now, but I remember in the early days of Zoom and Skype, at times it would be echo in the connection. In analysis, one hears oneself differently. I think this is one of the wonderful things of psychoanalysis, not only that an analyst may listen and maybe return something of what the analyst is listen back to the analyst, and already the analyst, while talking to someone in the position of the analyst, is more aware of what they are saying and is listening to themselves. So there is already this space, this already triangulation, where the analyst is already paying more attention to their own saying, and it creates a different space for the different type of agency. And I think it's of utmost importance for oppressed communities, be it by whatever tools society unhappily imposes on them for oppression. That I think that's the amazing potential of psychoanalysis, and in that sense, it's very anti-oppressive.
Absolutely. And that's how it has this liberatory potential, like you mentioned. What do you think about the fact that there's this, it seems to be like, on the one hand, this real liberatory potential that I feel is like the kernel, the core of psychoanalysis, and then this kind of aspect where people just tend to go to like the binary or the institute and like try to like lock everything down into these kinds of like theoretical arguments and
yeah, it's very surprising because you see a very big disconnect between what we may call psychoanalytic foundational thinking and psychoanalytic theory, even psychoanalytic, I hope psychoanalytic practice, but I know unhappily that's not the case for every practitioner, that if somebody is faithful to the fundamental rule, the same one with which you invite me to talk, say whatever comes to mind, that I think that fundamental rule, it works for the analysis. You can say whatever, you're free to talk, and we will together listening to what you're saying differently. You will listen to that otherwise, and it will acquire a different connotation, and there will be a different resonance for those words in the space of the session. It's also something that is reminding the analysts themselves, don't listen with prejudice. You listen is sort of undifferentiated form. The floating attention, also one possible translation of how Freud proposes this as a premise of analytic listening, means undifferentiated attention, that you listen to all the material without privileging this or that, and maybe letting things rebound and produce echoes. And I think this is an important frame that allows for the analytic work to progress. So one may say that what then the analytic institutions created as ideals, models, are in a way symptoms and deviations from psychoanalysis. It's really, for me, astonishing to think that how can psychoanalysts, if they listen carefully to the material that is brought to the session, how could they imagine that there is a primacy of a certain sexual function or a sexual or a sort of hierarchy of a uses a certain body part as a model of health? I think those are symptomatic constructions that in a way are contradicted already by early psychoanalytic tests. And I'm, for instance, referring to the 3 essays on the sexual theory of Freud, 1905. It's a very old text, more than 100 years old. And we know now, for instance, the work of Philip van Houten and Herman Westernick, that they did a very important work by retracing the first edition of the 3 essays, and they realized that at least in the first edition, Freud was not yet working with the model of the Oedipal complex. Is a text that in a way proposes a non-heteronormative conception of sexuality, something that queer theories like Chris Lane or Tim Dean have noted, that if we look at the 3 essays, already notion of the drive that Freud proposes is the drive that doesn't have any predetermined object besides satisfaction. And not only that, the drive is searching satisfaction, and the object is contingent and indifferent. So if we follow this in already in very early texts of foundational texts of psychoanalysis, we wonder, where did the post-Freudian analysts get the idea that there is one model of sexuality that is normal and one is not? One thing one could learn from the 3 essays is that human sexuality is infantile, polymorphous, so it's impossible to sustain theoretically. But I think these are symptoms that have to do with politics, institutional deviations, and a certain recalcitrant resistance to the unconscious, even by psychoanalysts themselves. I think when I make this silly joke that I have done too many times, but I will indulge a la Zizek into bad jokes, repeat it over and over again, and I will say that I said that people at times will not question whether or not poor people have a soul, like early conquistadores were wondering whether or not the native population had a soul, but they seem to imply, whenever I mention my experience having conducted psychoanalytic cures in the barrio, that they seem to be surprised, a sort of knee-jerk reaction. And in fact, it's as if they were saying that people are poor to afford an unconscious. Nobody would say that openly. Nobody would say the poor don't have a soul, but they seem to imply that they cannot work productively with their unconscious. And this, I think you were, Vanessa, referring to this idea that people have to be sophisticated enough to do psychoanalysis. They are naturalizing poverty, assuming that somebody who happens to be poor, these are social conditions that are historically determined, that somebody is poor because of a certain social condition. There is no essential poor feature in the psyche. Nevertheless, you find tons of elaborations in psychoanalytic literature, even with the hypothesis that poor people are psychically different. They have different instinct, different uses, less defenses, more primal need, horrendous and very prejudiced constructions that are, of course, totally false, and seem to imply a naturalization of poverty that becomes an internalized psychic feature. It's as if you were saying people are poor because they want to be poor. They desire it unconsciously. Nobody would say that, but it's the consequence of that type of theoretical construction. And I would challenge them, if you were to maybe bracket off certain social traversals, for instance, a report of a shooting in the barrio on a daily basis, as it was in my practice in the barrio, the content, if you compare a content of a middle-class person with the context of a session of a person in the barrio, libidinally speaking, it would be impossible to tell the social class. I would challenge, we cannot. There is the psychic dynamic. There is no essential difference, but there is this construction that poor people are different, therefore they should not, that psychoanalysis would be only for those who can afford it.
Yeah,
Which
exactly
bring
like
us,
said,
yes.
Like they're not sophisticated enough in some way. I remember in psychoanalytic training,
yeah.
they like when you have people come into the institute and they make you like figure out, they take weeks and weeks to figure out if the person's like able to be in psychoanalysis, you know. It's just like,
yeah, but then I think the ability there is, as Lacan says, there is only one resistance, the analyst. Maybe the person who was not sophisticated enough to do psychoanalysis was the practitioner. I wouldn't put it on the analyst, because if you listen, and in a way was what happened to me. I was practicing as a psychoanalyst in a barrio clinic in a place where I wasn't expected to be doing psychoanalysis, of course. It was a mental health clinic. I was supposed to be in a social setting that works more as a space for buffering rather than providing any space for transformation. And there what I couldn't help but do was listening to the unconscious. And I was lucky enough that the population I was working with was mostly of Puerto Rican origin, and already they gave to dreams a big importance. They would often believe that dreams have message hidden, and often they would feel that dreams was a space where maybe the dead would communicate with the living, or there was a message contained in the dream and they would then decode it to maybe play a number at lotto. But they would be very happy to talk about their dreams, and they remember their dreams. Some of them would write them down. So I felt that there was, let's say, if all we need for psychoanalysis is transference and resistance, those two were there. And I think there's maybe this missing or the lacking sophistication. We should examine it on the side of those practicing it, not so much of those who could benefit from it.
Agreed.
And
I'm
maybe
gonna use
maybe
that.
yeah. And also there is, I think, often semantics are helpful. When Freud talk about lay analysis, he uses the word lay, and I was happy to find that the etymology of the word lay analysis, when he was coined this description to try to take psychoanalysis away from medicine, which is unhappily what happened in the US. It developed as a sub-medical specialty, that he was defending psychoanalysis as a separate discipline, away from medicine, and maybe even away from a traditional scientific model. Maybe if a scientific model for psychoanalysis would be the conjectural sciences, not hard sciences, not physics, not medicine, not chemistry. And he was also trying to protect the practicing analyst status, that analysts didn't need to be MDs or nurses or social workers or psychologists to practice that. In fact, Freud felt that better training to become an analyst was to know about opera, literature, about myth, and that the humanities were a better place to acquire a formation to become an analyst. And he chooses the idea of lay analysis, and the word lay means of the people. So I would say that a psychoanalysis that is not of the people and for the people could not be properly called psychoanalysis. And unhappily, this is something forgotten, at least in the US. There was an adaptation, a sort of, it's a paradoxical decolonization, because I'm always very surprised that if you think of the early days of psychoanalysis in the US, psychoanalysis was in a way popularized and too enthusiastically adopted, and Freud was very skeptical about that. He was invited to give lectures in the early 20th century. I think it was 1905.
1909.
1909. So very early on, and he was warmly welcome, and he went to Clark University. So he's very well received, too well received. He wanted resistance. When they were saying transference and resistance, there was only transference and no resistance. And he was very suspicious. He was afraid that psychoanalysis would become a religion. And I think he became a religion, but a sort of a religion, the type of religions one could watch on TV, a sort of private church, very profitable private church that distorted psychoanalysis, and I think lost this edge. And by saying psychoanalysis of the people and for the people, remind us of a development that, for instance, psychoanalysis to have in Latin America. In most of Latin America, not for everyone, but for many, psychoanalysis kept that the edge associated with social movements, with social conscience, with the left. So that's something that is hard to imagine in the North American context, in the US in particular. And so there is this clear politicization in Latin America, where it hadn't lost. And if you think of the early days of psychoanalysis, and for me was very important the work of Elizabeth Danto in her book Freud's Free Clinics, where she documents something that is forgotten from, of course, the social memory, but also from psychoanalytic history. We don't talk about that much as psychoanalysts of this 20 years, this period between First World War I and Second World War, where there was this network, mostly in Europe, of free clinics, where psychoanalysis had to be made accessible to all those who can benefit from it. And I'm not I don't think psychoanalysis works well with universals. That's the tension in psychoanalysis, that times we seem to argue for universal, a sort of universal subjective structure, but we are working in singular cases, case by case. This tension, I think, inherent to psychoanalysis. I don't think that psychoanalysis would be good in every single case, but is for me symptomatic and suspicious the total exclusion of psychoanalysis from, for instance, from settings such as barrios. So I would think that it's interesting to know that those same analysts who were involved in these free clinics, who were very conscious of the responsibility as brokers of change, not only at a subjective individual level, but also at the social level, that there was a responsibility that analysts had for society as well. And there is this famous speech that Freud, and it was repeated a lot during the pandemic, not yet, First World War had not yet finished. He gives this speech in Budapest, and he, in a way, states the obvious: the rich and the poor has as much right to benefit from psychoanalysis, and he imagines a future when people will have access to a cure for the tuberculosis, and they will have as much availability for that kind of treatment as they would for psychoanalysis, which brings very current issues in the US: accessibility to universal health care. Who can get access to tuberculosis treatment today in the US is not yet universal, and who can have access to psychoanalysis. Maybe we need to also consider that as problematic. But it's for me interesting to see that those analysts that were so engaged in their social mission, not only their responsibility as individual practitioners in the private practice, also they were all involved in the free clinics, moved to the US, and then suddenly this transformation takes place, and there is this deviation in psychoanalytic practice and even thinking, and the same people who were at times actively politically involved decolonize, in a way, cut away this European social conscious past and Americanized psychoanalysis in a way that became perhaps paradoxically too compliant. So maybe decolonization needs a component of deviance to be fully decolonized. So in a way, they cut away with the European heritage, that type of European heritage, but Americanize it in the sense of transforming psychoanalysis into a very lucrative practice. The model was to make as much money as a plastic surgeon. And I always say, indeed, you cannot do 5 times a week Botox. I think your face would be too frozen, but you can do 5 times a week psychoanalysis, and for equal fees, if not more. So I think there is something there to reconsider about when we accept Paul Preciado's challenge. Okay, let's decolonize, but how? And what type of decolonization we need to put into practice. Yes.
Absolutely. I have to tell you too, I've recently been asked to edit a book on the queer heritage of psychoanalysis, talking about these exact things, like early, like Freud and writing the letter to the parents of a homosexual, saying like, I'm not going to try to change them, and this kind of thing, like with the 3 essays, the earliest reading, looking at these things in the early times of psychoanalysis. So I don't know if you already have a home for this talk turning into a paper, or if you want to write something else, but I'm soliciting you for something if you would like to be a part. It will be next year though, but I'm just letting you know now.
Okay, good. So this talk comes also with a nice invitation. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Good.
Sounds perfect.
Good.
Was
So it's good that you're asking me to write, because there is something that is difficult for analysts to find the space and the time for writing. But I find that it's in a way, if we think that the process of analysis and it's already how Freud tells us to do dream interpretation, is treating what is said in the session like a text, is important for the analysts, for us analysts, to do their own process of transcribing what we are thinking and producing a text. I personally find that I clarify my thinking when I have to write about things I'm thinking about, or things that, again, I learned from the practice, and I would like to insist on everything I have done so far. It comes to me from the practice. I think I'm very grateful for the generosity of my analysts, who had been constantly sharing with me things that allow me to see what we may then describe as social movements, but happening 5 years, maybe with at times 10 years, we start hearing things in the practice on the couch that then we will read about them on the news, or see them in papers, in collections, maybe a decade later. So in a way, we have this wonderful possibility of, we're talking about time, of maybe being ahead, being like New Zealanders in comparison to North Americans, that we are in a way one day ahead of what will happen. So it's the nice benefit of this time of the unconscious, which is not the chronological one.
Absolutely keeps us on the cutting edge. And I think about that all the time, what a privilege it is to hear so many people's kind of stories and internal worlds, and how it helps me, learn so much and grow so much. Just like hearing so many different perspectives and understanding so many different kinds of ways of thinking and being is so generative in so many ways. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention before we wrapped up?
I think I talk a lot, so
yes, that's great.
Many things. It's my revenge, since I talk in the sessions, but I'm mostly listening, and if I talk, is trying to be close to that. The speech of the analyst. These moments are precious to me, because it allows me to maybe take revenge and speak. And also, you're a good listener, so thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
And giving me this wonderful invitation, say whatever comes to mind.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye,
Vanessa.
Patricia.
Great seeing you.
Good to see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.